I hate what Marvel did to the Scarlet Witch. Before we could talk about Wanda's psychology, we need to talk about who she was before the fractures started showing. Because the tragedy of her character lands only if you understand what she was working with before everything collapsed. Wanda Maximoff made her debut in X-Men number 4 back in March of 1964, created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. She was introduced as a member of Magneto's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, but that framing is immediately complicated by the book itself. She and her twin brother Pietro, who would come to be known as Quicksilver, were not there out of ideology. They were there because Magneto had saved Wanda's life when a mob of angry villagers turned on her for using her mutant powers. She owed him a debt. That is the very first thing readers learn about Wanda Maximoff. She joined a criminal organization not out of malice, but out of loyalty, out of fear, and out of desperation for a protector in a world that had already tried to destroy her. However, within a year of her introduction, she and Pietro left the Brotherhood and joined the Avengers in Avengers number 16. She spent the better part of the next decade as a hero. Reliable, powerful, depending on who was writing her, developed her abilities under the mentorship of the ancient witch Agatha Harkness. She fell in love with the Vision, a synthetic android and a fellow Avenger, and their relationship became one of the most unique and genuinely moving romances in the publisher's history. Eventually, they would marry and build a life together, and in Vision and Scarlet Witch number 12 in 1986, Wanda used her chaos magic to do something unprecedented. She made herself pregnant. She gave birth to twin sons, William and Thomas. And for a brief moment, Wanda Maximoff had everything she ever wanted. She had a partner who loved her unconditionally. She had children. She had a sense of belonging. She had a family. That was the baseline and that was the foundation. Because what happens next is a story and Marvel pulling that foundation from underneath Wanda. Now I want to pause this story for a moment. Let's talk about psychosis. Not the Hollywood version, not the crazy person with a weapon that gets plastered all over movie trailers, not the actual clinical picture, but psychosis. Psychosis is at its core a disruption in a person's relationship with reality. The clinical definition describes it as a condition in which a person experiences a loss of contact with the external world, most commonly through hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and significantly impaired reality testing. That last phrase, reality testing, is critical. Reality testing is the mental process by which we distinguish what is actually happening from what our internal emotional state is telling us what is happening. When that process breaks down, the emotional world and the external world begin to collapse into one another. Now, I just want to throw out a disclaimer because psychosis is not simply a disease that some people are born with. Psychosis exists on a spectrum, and trauma is one of the most powerful catalysts for it. The relationship between trauma and the psychotic symptoms is well documented in clinical literature. Research published in the Psychology and Psychotherapy Theory, Research, and Practice in 2024 specifically highlight childhood interpersonal trauma through abuse, neglect, loss, and abandonment, as played as a casual role not just in PTSD, but in the development of psychotic experiences themselves. The mechanisms involve something called dissociation, a process by which the mind, when confronted with unbearable emotional content, begins to fragment. It separates the experience of reality into pieces that can be managed in isolation because taking the whole picture would be too overwhelming to survive. This association is a spectrum too. At its mild end, you have daydreaming, spacing out, feeling detached from your own body in moments of stress. At its severe end, you have a complete breakdown from reality, states in which a person is no longer able to accurately perceive or process what is happening. The DSM-5, which is a diagnostic and manual used by mental health professionals, actually includes a dissociative subtype of PTSD specifically because the overlap between severe trauma response and psychotic-like symptoms is so significant. The National Center for PTSD notes that this subtype is categorized by additional symptoms beyond standard PTSD. There's depersonalization, which is the feeling of detachment from one's own body and mind, and derealization, which is the experience of the external world as unreal, distorted, or dreamlike. Both of these, in their extreme forms, are functionally indistinguishable from psychosis. The world stops being the world, memories stop being reliable, and the self becomes unmoored. And then there's impulsivity, which, when you look at it, directly ties to the actions of Wanda Maximoff. Research published in the European Journal of Psychotraumatology found that the traumatic exposure interacts with the impulsivity in ways that fundamentally change how a person regulates their emotional response. The key dimension here is what researchers call urgency, specifically the tendency to act rationally in the presence of extreme emotional distress. When the nervous system has been chronically dysregulated by trauma, when the capacity to tolerate intense emotions have been compromised by repeated overwhelming experience, the gaps between feeling and action shrinks, sometimes disappearing entirely. Think about what that does and what that means. In an ordinary person, that might manifest as snapping at loved ones during an argument, or making a decision they'll regret when they are frightened or grieving. In a person with the ability to reshape reality itself, a woman who can bend the laws of physics with her subconscious emotional state, impulsivity is not a personal failing, it's a catastrophic one waiting to happen. That is Wanda Maximoff. Back to the comics. It's 1989. John Byrne is writing Avengers West Coast, and he has decided to break Wanda Maximoff in ways the character has never been broken before. The first blow comes when the United States government, operating on the premise a synthetic android with access to classified computer networks, posed a national security threat, and they kidnapped the Vision. Because they kidnapped him, they used his body and they dismantled him. When he returned to Wanda, he had been stripped completely. His memory erased, his emotional processors, his entire interior life was gone. The man she loved, the man she had built her life with, looked at her with empty eyes. It was the Vision's body, but no one was there. That alone would have been devastating, but John Byrne wasn't finished. Shortly after, in Avengers West Coast number 52, the villain Master Pandemonium revealed the truth about Billy and Tommy. Wanda's children, the sons she had carried, given birth to, raised, were not real. They were constructs, fragments of her own chaotic power that had manifested in physical form, unknowingly drawing on the shards of the demon Mephisto's soul. When Mephisto reclaimed those shards, Billy and Tommy ceased to exist. At this point, Wanda's husband had been hollowed out, her children had been erased, everything she had built, the family, the life, the belonging she craved ever since she was a teenager fleeing a mob of villagers, was revealed to have been, in some fundamental sense, not real. She broke. What followed in John Byrne's run, which was completed by Roy and Dan Thomas after Byrne's departure from the book, is known informally as the Darker Than Scarlet arc. Wanda, in a psychotic state, became a villain for a period. She attacked the Avengers. She was manipulated by the time traveler entity Immortus, who, it was revealed, had been interfering with her life for years, engineering her suffering. She was eventually restored to herself, but the damage had been done. The fracturing had appeared in the bedrock. What Byrne understood and what makes this arc so important to Wanda's psychological history is that the breakdown was not arbitrary. It was the natural consequences of cumulative loss delivered without any framework for processing or recovering from it. She didn't just lose her husband and her children in a simple way just to make her feel sad. She lost her entire architect for her own understanding. She had no self left to regulate. Agatha Harkness, recognizing the dangers of Wanda confronting this loss head on, actually used magic to suppress Wanda's memories of her children entirely. The grief was there, buried, but Wanda had no conscious access to it. In this decision to suppress rather than process, to hide the wound rather than heal it, is a detail that everything else in her story hangs on. Let's have a moment and talk about suppression, because I think that is one of the most unappreciated dynamics in traumatic psychology, and it is absolutely central to understanding what happens to Wanda. When clinicians talk about grief and trauma, one of the most fundamental concepts is that unexpressed or suppressed grief does not disappear, it accumulates. The emotional context of a traumatic loss, the rage, the confusion, the overwhelming helplessness, does not dissolve simply because the conscious mind is no longer given access to it. It continues to exert pressure from beneath the surface. It continues to inform behavior, to heighten emotional reactivity, to erode the capacity for impulse control. It is the psychological equivalent of a structured crack that keeps widening even when the building continues to stand. This was well supported in the clinical literature on complex PTSD, which specifically addressed what happens when a person experiences prolonged or repeated traumatic exposure rather than a single event. Complex PTSD, often abbreviated as CPTSD, is characterized by hyperarousal, emotional dysregulation, intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, negative self-beliefs, in profound difficulties in interpersonal relationships. Its presence does not require a dramatic single incident. It can develop slowly across years of accumulated loss and destabilization. Wanda spent years between the John Burns arc and Avengers Disassembled as a hero, but she was a hero carrying a buried wound she had no conscious awareness of. She was functioning on a foundation that was quietly crumbling. And the thing about suppressed grief is that it does not wait for a convenient moment to resurface. It waits for a trigger, and then it returns with the full force of everything that was never allowed to come through. The trigger arrived in 2004. Brian Michael Bendis was given control of the Avengers franchise, and he used it to write the most consequential and most controversial Scarlet Witch story in Marvel history, Avengers Disassembled. The inciting incident was deceptively small. Janet Van Dyne, the Wasp, accidentally mentioned Billy and Tommy to Wanda in the conversation, a casual reference to the children Agatha's magic had buried in Wanda's subconscious. That was all it took. The suppression broke. The grief that had been contained for over a decade came flooding back, not subtly, not gradually, but all at once, with the force amplified by years of compression. And with it came psychosis. Wanda didn't just simply remember her children felt sad. She began to experience a break from reality. She lost the ability to distinguish between what was actually happening and what her emotional state was generating. Her chaos magic, the power that responds to her will, her perception, her emotional landscape, became an instrument of catastrophe. She resurrected the fallen hero Jack of Hearts and directed him to explode at Avengers Mansion. She forced the Vision to crash a Quinjet into the building, and she attacked her teammates, the people she fought alongside for a decade. She engineered the deaths of Scott Lang and the Vision himself. She didn't do any of these things because she was becoming malevolent. She did them because she was in a psychotic state in which the boundaries between internal experience and external reality have been dissolved. This is exactly what the clinical literature describes as a relationship between psychotic positive symptoms and the violent or impulse behavior. Research from the European Psychiatry Journal found that the impulsivity is a significant predictor of harmful behavior in the context of early psychosis, and that the effects is potentiated or made worse when positive symptoms like delusion and hallucinations are combined with impaired insight into one's own condition. Wanda at this moment had no insight. She had no internal observer capable of saying, this is grief, this is trauma, this is not the world as it actually is. The whole apparatus of this kind of reality testing has been overwhelmed. The hero's response is worth examining because it tells us something about how Marvel, and by extension the culture that produced Marvel, chose to frame Wanda's breakdown. The Avengers and the X-Men convened and debated whether she should be simply killed, not treated, not helped, but killed. As one critical essay from AIPT Comics pointed out, the purpose solution to a mentally ill woman's suffering was to put her down before she could harm anyone else, and the story ultimately validates that fear by having her breakdown produce consequences devastating enough that the hero's concerns seem reasonable in retrospect. That framing is problematic, and it's worth naming as such, because what the narrative chose to do was to make Wanda's mental illness the villain, not Wanda herself, but the disease. And in doing so, the reinforcement of the association between psychosis and danger, between trauma and moral culpability, become reinforced. But that is the critique of storytelling, not an erasure of the psychological realism that underlines it. Wanda's breakdown in Avengers Disassembled is psychologically coherent. What is less coherent is the moral weight the narrative asks us to assign to it. Avengers Disassembled led directly into the 2005 miniseries House of M. Wanda, in the aftermath of her breakdown, was taken to Genosha under the care of her father Magneto and Professor Xavier. She showed little signs of recovery, so the debate began on whether she should be killed. And her brother, instigating the moment, told Wanda what was going to happen, and Wanda reshaped reality. She created a world where mutants were the dominant species, in which Magneto ruled, in which everyone got what they wanted the most, a wish fulfillment reality on the global scale. And within that reality, Wanda herself had her children back. She had her family. She had the life that she had always wanted that was taken away from her. What's interesting is that this is the most psychologically revealing thing that Wanda's ever done, and I think it gets lost in the spectacle of the event. In clinical terms, what Wanda constructed in House of M is best understood as an extreme dissociative retreat, a total replacement of an unbearable reality with a constructed one that the psyche can survive. This is not unique to psychosis. Humans do this all the time in smaller ways, when reality becomes too painful to inhabit. The difference is that most humans do not have the power to impose their constructive reality on the external world. Wanda does. And so what would have been done in an ordinary person, a private fantasy or a dissociative episode, becomes a planetary scale reconstruction of existence. It is grief given omnipotence. When Wolverine's memories, unaffected by the reality warp given his mutant ability to heal, allowed him to piece together what was happening, and when heroes eventually confronted Wanda in this constructed world, she broke again. And it was that second breakdown that she said these words. Those 3 words led to the decimation. Over 90% of the mutants' population in the world depowered in a single moment. Wanda had come into the event as a woman in agony, and she left it as the architect of the most significant arc of genocide in Marvel Comics history. A genocide she enacted not with hate, but with despair. But there's something important to understand about the psychology of what happened in that moment. Researchers studying the relationship between trauma, impulsivity, and psychosis have found that the urgent dimension of impulsivity, acting without premeditation in the grip of overwhelming emotional distress, is the most destructive when the person's insight into their own condition is minimal. Wanda, at the moment she depowered the mutants, was not in a state of reasoned choice. It was a state of emotional overwhelm, making a decision at the speed of feeling without the capacity to fully process what she was doing or why. 3 words spoken from the depths of psychotic break, rooted in decades of accumulated grief and suppressed trauma. This is not villainy, this is the worst possible outcome of untreated psychological suffering combined with unlimited power. In the wake of House of M, Wanda disappeared. However, she reemerged years later during the Avengers Crusade storyline. In this arc, I would argue, is the most nuanced treatment of her psychological state that Marvel has ever produced. Wanda returned with no memory of what she had done. She had been living as an ordinary woman in a small town in Europe. When the Young Avengers, including Wiccan and Speed, who were Billy and Tommy reincarnated, found her and the full weight of her actions was restored to her, she did not minimize it. She did not rationalize it. She looked at the consequences of what she had done in the worst moments of her worst breakdown and took responsibility for them. The Children's Crusade is important because it refuses the easy answers on both ends. It does not allow Wanda to simply be the victim of her illness, absolved of all responsibility, but it also does not allow the heroes who want to execute her to occupy an uncomplicated moral high ground. The story asks a genuinely difficult question: what do we owe to a person who, in the depths of a psychological break, catalyzed by decades of accumulated loss, caused irreversible harm? And it does not pretend to have a clean answer. Wanda's rehabilitation arc across subsequent series, including the 2015 Scarlet Witch solo by James Robinson and later in the 2023 run by Steve Orlando, had largely been about trying to live inside of that complexity. She had acknowledged what she had done and she was working to repair what could be repaired. She struggled with her own identity, her relationships to her power, and her place in a community that has every reason not to trust her. Let's talk about what Marvel got wrong and why I said my statement in the beginning of hating what Marvel did to the Scarlet Witch. For all the psychological depth that accumulated in Wanda's story, Marvel has also used her breakdown in ways that are generally problematic. The most frequently cited critique, and the one that I share, is that in Avengers Disassembled and House of M, they frame Wanda's mental illness primarily as a threat to be managed rather than a condition to be understood. The hero's response was institutional, not compassionate. The narrative ultimately validates their fear by making the worst case scenario come true. Wanda was not treated, she was contained, debated, and then the containment before doing the single most worst thing she's ever done. And the story uses that sequence to retroactively suggest that the people who wanted to kill her had a point. That is a damaging message, whether it is intentional or not, because what it says implicitly through the mechanics of the plot is that the right response to a person in severe psychotic distress is to euthanize them, not to help them. And given what we know from the clinical literature about how treatable and how human trauma related psychosis actually is, that framing does a disservice not just to Wanda, but to every reader who had experienced something like that before. There's also a broader issue which applies beyond Wanda. of Marvel's tendency to use female characters' most severe psychological crises as plot engines without giving their characters the internal space to process what's happening to them. See my Jean Grey video for more. I did a video on how Jean Grey ended up becoming a martyr because of the Phoenix arc, and this also accompanied with Wanda's breakdown and Moondragon's possession by the Dragon of the Moon. These stories take women at their most psychological vulnerable and use that vulnerability to generate dramatic consequences for the universe around them, rather than treating the women themselves as the primary subject of the narrative. Wanda in particular has spent more time being discussed by other characters, being debated, assessed, feared, than she has spent giving access to her own entirety. For a character whose entire story is about the relationship between inner emotional life and external reality, this is a significant structural problem. The more recent solo series had worked to correct this. James Robinson's 2015 run gave Wanda her own ongoing psychological project, traveling the world, repairing witch magic, confronting her history directly rather than having it weaponized against her. Steve Orlando's 2023 series pushed further, giving her a genuine community and a sustained examination of identity and power on her own terms. These are promising directions. They are also notably the stories that feature Wanda as an active agent of her own narrative, rather than a passing object of other people's strategic calculations. I want to end with something that goes beyond the comics, because I think the reason Wanda Maximoff has resonated so powerfully for so long in the comics and in the MCU and the cultural conversation around her is that she's given form to something that generally is difficult to talk about directly. There's a part in every human being that understands on a gut level what it means to have a loss that's too large to process. There's a part of every human being that knows the feeling of grief that cannot be integrated, that sits down below consciousness and makes the world feel slightly unreal, slightly dangerous, slightly like a place that could turn on you without warning. Most of us do not have chaos magic, but some of us have at some point constructed a version of the world inside of our minds that was shaped more by our pain than by external reality. Some of us have at some point acted from the wound rather than the wisdom. Wanda Maximoff is that impulse given cosmic scale. She is the nightmare version of what it means to be human and traumatized and powerful in a world that does not know how to hold you. The psychosis is not the thing that made Wanda inhuman. It is the thing that makes her heartbreakingly, tragically, recognizably human. And that, more than any superpower or costume or comic event, is why she matters. If this video made you think about Wanda differently or the trauma differently, I want to hear about it in the comments below. Now, this character's had over 60 years of publication history, and it was kind of fun to dig through, as well as getting the psychological information to incorporate in this video. And we barely scratched the surface on everything that her story contains. So if I missed anything, please let me know in the comments below. If you're new to the channel, hi, thank you for watching. These are the kind of videos that I produce where we look at psychological aspects of comic book characters to see what makes them tick and makes them who they are. If you found this video interesting, please do all the YouTube things, like, share, subscribe. I'm Anderson. Thanks for watching.